requires balance. It requires that when someone commits a crime, they be punished. It requires that when someone damages another person, that person be compensated for his damages. In today's case, justice requires that Mr. Ramirez be compensated for the injuries he sustained as a result of the defendant's wanton and unreasonable acts. Mr. Ramirez was involved in an altercation with the defendant and his partner. But Mr. Ramirez was also shot. Mr. Ramirez endured extreme physical pain, incurred weighty medical expenses, lost time of his job, and now suffers a diminished quality of life. Mr. Ramirez is here today to ask you to balance the scales for him. Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, my name is Laura Smith, and it is my privilege today to represent the plaintiff, Robert Ramirez. Mr. Ramirez is an ordinary man, a husband, a father, a carpenter, a man who enjoys pursuing athletic endeavors with his friends. Mr. Ramirez has had a difficult time these past several years as he has dealt with the fallout from the injuries that occurred when he was shot by the defendant. Mr. Ramirez has since lost his wife, and now the pain he suffers from this wound causes him difficulty in caring for his son, and it diminishes the quality of life that they enjoy together and the activities in which they can indulge. Mr. Ramirez used to enjoy playing sports, especially playing basketball with his son, but can no longer do this due to the injury he sustained at the defendant's hands. Mr. Ramirez sustained his injury one night as he was driving down California Avenue in Chicago. As he was driving down California Avenue, Mr. Ramirez fell in behind a car. This car was moving very slowly and contained two men. Mr. Ramirez attempted several times to pass this car, signaling and moving over, and each time the car would swerve over and block Mr. Ramirez from passing. Finally, Mr. Ramirez settled in behind the car and followed it very slowly for several blocks. Then, the other car pulled over, and Mr. Ramirez pulled alongside and was shouting his irritation at the driver of the other car. Suddenly, the other car made a left into Evergreen Avenue. Mr. Ramirez decided to follow. Out of this fateful decision would come Mr. Ramirez's injury with all of its suffering and pain and the diminished enjoyment of his life that were to follow. Mr. Ramirez stopped his car beside the car that contained the two men. The driver of the car exited and came to the front of his car. Mr. Ramirez exited his car and met the driver in the ground between the two cars. Mr. Ramirez and the driver then exchanged heated words, and someone struck a blow. The men scuffled, and as they scuffled, they moved along the cars toward the rear of both cars. At this point in time, the other man in the other car exited and came around the end of the car. The scuffle ended with the two men on the ground and Mr. Ramirez pinned by the other man, the driver of the other car. At this point in time, Mr. Ramirez was made aware of the fact that the two other men were police officers in plain clothes in an unmarked car. As soon as Mr. Ramirez was apprised of this fact, he stopped struggling with the driver and asked to see some identification. It was at this time, as Mr. Ramirez rolled over to get to his feet, that Mr. Ramirez felt a strong pain in his back, and at first believed that he had been kicked by the man he had been struggling with. Mr. Ramirez said, "Why did you do that?" and then sank to the ground and blacked out. In reality, Mr. Ramirez had been shot in the back by the driver's partner, who had gotten out and come around the car during the scuffle. Mr. Ramirez has vague memories of two men talking above him, and then a memory of awakening in the hospital. This was the beginning of Mr. Ramirez's odyssey of pain, as they first stabilized him for extreme blood loss and shock, and then, once he was stabilized, nearly a month later, operated to remove a fragment of the bullet that had lodged in the rear of his heart. This required full open chest surgery and entailed a great deal of pain and suffering on Mr. Ramirez's part. Indeed, Mr. Ramirez lost 30+ pounds of weight from December when he was admitted to the hospital until the time he left at the end of January. Mr. Ramirez also missed a great deal of work and today suffers from extreme pain and an inability to do some of the same things that he once could do. Mr. Ramirez comes before you today to ask you, ladies and gentlemen of the jury, to help him receive the balance of justice. He may not have made the most prudent choice in going out with his friends and staying out very late and having a few drinks. And it's true that the fact that he was slightly inebriated may have affected his judgment when he followed this car down Evergreen Avenue. But Mr. Ramirez's actions did not at any time rise to such a level that it would justify the excessive force used by the defendant in dealing with the situation. And in fact, Mr. Ramirez was treated in a manner that is definitely frowned upon by the Chicago Police Department, as witnessed by their general order, stating that deadly force is to be used only when necessary to prevent bodily harm or death to an officer or another person, and is to be used only as a last resort after all other reasonable means have failed. The defendant will tell you that the reason that he shot Mr. Ramirez is because during the scuffle between Mr. Ramirez and the driver, Mr. Ramirez was wielding a knife, and that Mr. Ramirez stabbed the driver with this knife, and that Mr. Ramirez was raising this knife for another stab when he was shot by the defendant. However, the evidence will show that the knife found is a jackknife with a locking blade that was found on the ground near the scene, closed, and tests done revealed no discernible fingerprints and no blood on this knife. Further, both the defendant and his partner, the driver with whom Ramirez struggled, will testify that Mr. Ramirez wielded this knife with his right hand. Mr. Ramirez testifies, and this has been corroborated by his wife's deposition, that he is and always has been left-handed, and that he does not use his right hand. So why would he have held a knife to stab someone in his right hand? Mr. Ramirez therefore asks that you help him receive justice by balancing the scales and compensating him for the pain and suffering and damages that he has sustained as a result of the defendant's unreasonable and reckless action in shooting Mr. Ramirez before following his training and the rules of the Chicago Police Department and using all reasonable means to defuse the crisis. Ladies and gentlemen, justice requires balance. Thank you.